As we've documented on this show, all throughout election season, there are a record number of women running for office this year. But behind those campaigns, there's also been an unprecedented volunteer mobilization this year, and women are at the center of that, too. One organizer told All In that 3/4 of his organization's most active volunteers are women, and that 40% of those women hadn't done anything political before Donald Trump was elected. The women in the streets from the Women's March, it seems, are now in streets across America, knocking on doors and helping get people to the polls. Here with me now, Rebecca Traister, writer-at-large from New York Magazine, author of the fantastic book, Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. Rebecca, this is something you've been reporting on and I think witnessing firsthand as you've been out on the road. Not just the candidates, but the women volunteers, the people knocking on doors. It is astonishing how powerful that force is, particularly in Democratic politics.
And I think you're looking at so many of these women who, as you said, had perhaps been somnambulant, apathetic. Maybe they were Democratic voters, maybe they were irregular Democratic voters, and they have just, at least a segment of them, been shocked into a kind of activism that in many cases is taking over their lives. I talk again and again. I've been going around the country meeting women who just describe their every night, every weekend, every spare hour that's not spent doing their paid jobs, dedicated to working for campaigns or with organizations that are comprising this kind of infrastructure to deal with voter suppression, to funnel funds, create new ways of fundraising, new ways of supporting candidates. There are all kinds of new organizations from Run for Something, Sister District, Spread the Vote. Women are just getting involved in all these different ways trying to address the inequities and broken parts of the system. And a lot of those people are very new to this kind of work.
Yeah, the newness is what's interesting to me. I mean, what have you been hearing from people that went from being essentially maybe more passive participants to sort of committing a huge part of their lives to it?
Well, a lot of the women who'd been passive in the past are white suburban women who perhaps because of their own proximity to certain kinds of power and privilege hadn't been shocked into sort of an acknowledgement of the fact that the country's politics were broken, were sort of shocked by bias and hate and misogyny and racism and xenophobia coming out of the Trump campaign in 2016, and then shocked by the fact that he won. Perhaps some of them who were Hillary Clinton fans or voters and who just assumed she was going to win were shocked out of their apathy at the fact that she lost. And a lot of them have gotten a tremendous civic education in the past 2 years. They are learning about their local politics. They're engaged in their local politics. They're committed to local candidates. This is not just about a sort of, banner presidential year politics, which is why their engagement in these midterms can be so crucial. They are coming up with new ideas about how to organize. They're talking to each other in their anger and shock. They have formed new networks and the beginnings of new coalitions. They're learning about some of the history of progressive activism. They're learning about, in some cases, their own racial and class privilege and the way that it has blinkered them in the past. These are conversations I have had with women around the country in the past few weeks who I don't think would have had these kinds of conversations 3 years ago, 5 years ago.
That point's really interesting because I've been watching interviews with some of the women who are sort of doing this volunteering, particularly in places like Orange County or suburban Virginia, where you have a volunteer base that is largely white, relatively affluent, upper middle class women it's not just that they're invested, it's like their actual politics and worldview is changing through the sort of experience of doing the work.
Absolutely. They're learning things every day. And in many cases, because we have a roster, a historic number of women candidates, women of color candidates, candidates of color, candidates with progressive left politics, a lot of them find themselves in this position of doing work on behalf of black women, women of color running for office. They're turning to leadership, to black women who've been involved in organizing for many years, and they are learning from those women. And that's a dynamic, for example, in Georgia that's really key. A lot of the women who I went down and talked to around the Ossoff race in 2017 who were newly keyed up and very engaged in politics, but in that race they were working for a young white male candidate. Now they're going all out for Lucy McBath, for Stacey Abrams.
And that, I want to say that Lucy McBath race, that is to me one of the most interesting in the country for the reason Jon Ossoff, we all watched that race. That was the big marquee special election matchup, millions of dollars. Karen Handel, Jon Ossoff. Ossoff falls short. Lucy McBath, who's got an amazing story. She lost her son to gun violence and is running in that same district, is neck and neck, and not the candidate that would have been drafted by the Democratic Party political class a year ago, and right now is right poised to maybe win that race.
But this is a lesson, and it should be a lesson for all of us, and I think it's something that so many of this particular group of women that we're talking about have been learning, which is that new kinds of candidates who are not traditional candidates who the Democratic establishment wants to send forward, that these kinds of candidates can engage and lead. The people who've actually been doing this work for decades before us, often women of color, often marginalized people who've been in the trenches engaged long before 2016, are the people we might turn to for energetic and exciting and possible leadership going forward.
Yeah, I'm gonna that race. I have my eyes on that race as one of many tomorrow night. Rebecca Traister, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.